A plan was beginning to form. The first step was clear. Mason needed to ensure the HOA couldn't dismiss the federal ownership of the road. The next step would involve taking the matter to court, if necessary, to make the HOA legally acknowledge their error. This wasn't a simple case of paying a fine and moving on. It was about holding the HOA accountable for their actions and making sure no one else would be subjected to the same unjust treatment. As Mason hung up the phone, he felt a mix of determination and exhaustion. He was no longer just defending his property from a fine. He was challenging the system that allowed local organizations to wield power without proper checks. The search for truth had opened a new chapter in the fight for justice, one that Mason was prepared to see through, no matter the cost. Mason entered the HOA office with a determined stride, carrying a thick folder of documents. He had spent hours compiling everything to printout from the National Park Service, official land ownership records, and relevant correspondence. The stack was heavy in his hands, but the weight wasn't physical. It was the pressure of his fight for justice that weighed on him. Karen Preston, seated at her desk, looked up as he approached. Her face was expressionless, but there was a flicker of something, a smirk, perhaps, or just a hardened expectation that indicated she anticipated an easy win. She hadn't even given him a chance to speak. "You're wasting your time," Karen stated flatly. "The HOA has rules. You didn't follow them. End of story." Mason didn't flinch. He set the folder down on her desk with a soft thud, the papers neatly stacked. "I didn't break any rules, Karen. This road is owned by the government. You've been fining me for something you don't even control." Her eyes narrowed as she glanced briefly at the documents, but it was clear she didn't expect to be proven wrong. Instead, she turned her gaze back to him. "I don't care if it's the president's driveway. This is a private community. That road impacts property values. Mason," people complained. Mason remained calm. He had expected this, but he wasn't backing down. "People can complain all they want, but that road isn't mine to fix. I'm not paying a single penny for something that isn't even my responsibility. You have no right to fine me for a road the HOA doesn't own. The National Park Service owns it. The records are clear. The ownership is federal." Karen's expression stiffened. She didn't respond immediately, but it was clear she didn't want to engage with the facts. She picked up the papers and skimmed through the pages, perhaps hoping to find something to counter his claims. But the more she read, the more she realized the weight of the evidence in front of her. There was no disputing the ownership records. The facts didn't align with her narrative, and that became evident with each passing second. Her hands shook slightly as she set the papers down, eyes still glued to the documents, but her gaze now distant, almost unwilling to fully absorb the truth. After a brief pause, she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She moved toward her filing cabinet and returned with another sheet of paper, an official-looking notice. "If you want to fight this, take it to court," Karen said, her tone changing slightly, though still stern. "But I've already spoken to the board. They're not backing down." She handed him the new form, which appeared to be another fine, this one for an even higher amount. Mason took the form from her, glancing at it briefly before placing it back on her desk. He didn't need to look at it to know that it was just another attempt to assert authority. "This isn't about a fine. This is about the truth. You've been fining me for something I'm not responsible for. I'm not paying for your mistakes." Karen's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Mason saw the cracks in her composure. She was losing control. This wasn't a situation she could easily navigate with authority alone. She had been caught in a position where she couldn't manipulate the situation with her usual tactics. There was no denying it anymore. She had acted without due diligence, and now, the consequences were staring her in the face. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. She stood tall, attempting to regain her former posture, though it lacked the same conviction. "I'm just following the rules, Mason. It's not personal. The board made the decision. If you want to contest this, you can take it to court. I'm not going to change my stance." Mason didn't back away. He had seen enough of this system to know how it worked. It was never about justice. It was about power, influence, and controlling the narrative. The HOA had the upper hand in so many ways, but he was no longer willing to let them dictate the terms. "This isn't about rules anymore, Karen. It's about holding you accountable for your actions. I won't let you get away with fining me for something you don't own or control." She crossed her arms, unwilling to acknowledge the reality of the situation. "Then take it to court. I'm done discussing this." Mason gathered the documents and stuffed them back into his folder. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her one final time. "I'm not the one in the wrong here, Karen. You're just doing your job, but that job has consequences." With that, he walked out of the office, the weight of the fight still heavy on his shoulders. He knew the real battle had just begun. The HOA's refusal to back down would only make this more difficult, but Mason was ready. He had the facts on his side, and he wasn't going to let them be buried under bureaucracy. The next step was clear. He would take this to court, and he would fight not just for his property, but for the principle of accountability. The HOA's claim to authority was about to face a challenge it hadn't anticipated. Mason and his attorney, Sarah Hamilton, entered the courthouse with a clear focus on their objective. The case was more complicated than they anticipated, but they had no choice but to proceed. The HOA was determined to make Mason responsible for maintaining the road, despite the fact that the land was federally owned. Their challenge would be more than just showing that the road was not his responsibility. It would require proving that the HOA had not just made a mistake, but had acted negligently in assuming control over land that they did not own. The first hurdle was to establish the ownership of the land. Mason had already secured the documents from the National Park Service that clearly indicated federal ownership of the road, but he knew that the HOA wouldn't back down without a fight. They would argue that Mason should have known about the road's status and, therefore, should have taken steps to manage it. To that end, Sarah advised him that their argument had to go beyond the ownership records. They needed to prove that the HOA's oversight of the road was rooted in negligence. Negligence is going to be the crux of this case, Sarah explained. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, the HOA will claim that, as a member of the community, you were responsible for the road's condition, regardless of who owns it. They're going to say that you failed to maintain it, and that your neglect contributed to complaints about the road. It's your word against theirs. We need evidence that this issue is systemic and goes back years, not just an isolated incident. Mason understood the gravity of the situation. The HOA had acted under the assumption that they had jurisdiction over the road, but their repeated actions to fine him, without verifying the ownership, demonstrated a lack of due diligence. This wasn't a simple misstep, it was an ongoing failure to verify basic facts before enforcing penalties. Their decision to fine him had been based on an assumption that they had control over the road, even though they had no legal claim to it. The bigger issue, as Sarah pointed out, was that this was a systemic issue that extended beyond his case and touched on the HOA's handling of other properties in the neighborhood. As they entered the courtroom, Mason could already sense the uphill battle they faced. The HOA's legal team, led by Todd Ellison, was prepared to defend their position with every tool at their disposal. They would argue that Mason should have known about the ownership status of the road, that he should have raised the issue sooner. It was clear that the HOA would not back down easily, but Mason knew that, even with their resources, they were wrong. The only way to resolve this was to expose the truth of the HOA's oversight. Sarah advised Mason to focus on presenting the facts and avoiding unnecessary distractions. We don't need to get emotional or make this personal, she said. Stick to the documents, the records, and the legalities. This case is about the facts, not the personalities involved. Mason nodded, though the weight of the situation wasn't lost on him. If the court sided with the HOA, not only would he be liable for the fines, but the broader implications of the HOA's unchecked power over property owners could affect many others in the community. This wasn't just about one road, it was about ensuring that organizations like the HOA could not impose penalties on individuals without clear legal authority. The case began with the HOA's attorney, Todd Ellison, outlining their position. He spoke with confidence, presenting a clear narrative that the road was part of the HOA's purview and that Mason had neglected it. He argued that the complaints from residents about the road's condition were enough to hold Mason accountable, regardless of its ownership status. The defendant has failed to take responsibility for the road, despite repeated warnings and complaints from members of the community, Todd said. This failure to act has resulted in a loss of property value and community dissatisfaction. Sarah stood up to counter the argument. She presented the documents from the National Park Service, making it clear that the road in question was under federal ownership and not the HOA's. This road has never been part of the HOA's responsibility, she argued. The defendant is not liable for its upkeep. The fines levied against him are based on incorrect assumptions, and the HOA has failed to verify the ownership of the property before taking legal action. Todd attempted to undermine Sarah's argument by questioning the validity of the National Park Service's records. He argued that the documents were not sufficient evidence of ownership and that the court should disregard them in favor of the HOA's internal records. But Sarah was prepared. She presented additional evidence, including land maps and government correspondence, all supporting the federal ownership of the road. The evidence was undeniable. The turning point came when Sarah called a witness to the stand, an expert in property law who had reviewed the ownership records and the legal history of the road. The witness confirmed that the road had always been under federal control and that the HOA had no legal claim to it. This testimony was crucial in solidifying their case and undermining the HOA's argument. The HOA's defense was increasingly weak as the evidence mounted against them. They had failed to verify the ownership of the road and had acted without proper due diligence. In contrast, Mason had acted responsibly by presenting the correct records and challenging the fines that were wrongly imposed on him. The court was beginning to see the truth. As the trial progressed, Sarah's legal strategy became clear. She wasn't just defending Mason's rights, she was exposing the systemic failures of the HOA and holding them accountable for their actions. This wasn't just about a single fine or a single road, it was about ensuring that organizations like the HOA couldn't operate without scrutiny, making decisions based on assumptions and imposing penalties without justification. In the final moments of the trial, Mason felt a sense of clarity. The case had become a matter of principle, not just about him. It was about ensuring that the HOA could no longer impose fines or make decisions without verifying the facts first. He wasn't just fighting for his own property. He was fighting to ensure that others wouldn't face the same injustices in the future. The judge deliberated briefly, and Mason's fate rested in their hands. But he was confident. The facts were on his side. The case had shifted from an individual dispute to a broader challenge against unchecked authority. And in that moment, he knew that no matter the outcome, the fight had already been won. The system had been challenged, and it would never be the same again. The court proceedings continued with the HOA's attorney, Todd Ellison, taking the floor. His approach was calculated, trying to shift the focus away from the ownership issue and onto Mason's supposed negligence. Your Honor, the defendant has been negligent in maintaining the property, particularly this road, Todd stated, his voice firm. This failure has led to a significant decline in the neighborhood's property value. We have witnesses who can attest to the negative impact. The mention of witnesses was a strategic move by Todd to bolster his argument. He intended to paint Mason as careless, suggesting that his lack of action regarding the road had directly harmed the community. The implication was clear. Mason's failure to take responsibility for the road was damaging to the HOA and to the other property owners. By introducing witnesses, Todd was attempting to add credibility to this claim. However, Mason knew this was a tactic designed to cloud the real issue. Mason's attorney, Sarah Hamilton, was not intimidated. She had anticipated that the opposition would try to turn the focus onto Mason's alleged negligence. Sarah's response was sharp and precise. Your Honor, it's essential to address the facts. The road in question is not the responsibility of Mr. Mason or the HOA. It is owned by the National Park Service, a fact supported by official records. To claim that Mr. Mason has been negligent is not only unfounded, but it completely disregards the legal ownership of the land. Todd's witness testimony would have been a potential blow if it had been allowed to stand unchecked. But Sarah quickly dismantled the argument. She challenged the credibility of the witnesses by pointing out that they were not qualified to speak on the legal ownership of the road. The HOA's case was built on an assumption, not on verified facts, and Sarah made it clear that they had failed to prove the road was Mason's responsibility. Despite the mounting evidence in Mason's favor, Todd's strategy to shift the blame remained persistent. He continued to press the narrative that Mason's lack of action had contributed to a decline in property values. It was an argument that relied on perception and community sentiment rather than on legal standing. Todd's goal was to make Mason appear as though he were an irresponsible member of the neighborhood, someone who didn't care about the welfare of the community. But Sarah continued to focus on the facts. Effectively neutralizing Todd's emotional appeal, the hidden bias in the case became more apparent as the trial wore on. Karen Preston, the HOA representative, had been actively involved in orchestrating the fines against Mason from the beginning. Her position within the HOA gave her significant influence, and her clear bias against Mason was evident. She had been so certain of her position that she had never even bothered to verify the road's ownership before issuing the fines. Now, as the trial unfolded, it was clear that her actions had been driven by a desire to maintain control, not by a commitment to fairness. Karen's attitude during the trial, her demeanor, her posture, and her calculated statements highlight her hidden bias. She wasn't simply seeking justice. She was seeking to uphold the HOA's power, even at the expense of truth. This bias became even more apparent when she attempted to dismiss the legal documents and records Mason had provided. She ignored the factual evidence and instead focused on maintaining the narrative that the HOA had been in the right. Despite the attempts to undermine him, Mason stayed composed, knowing the focus had to remain on the legality of the situation. The HOA had been acting without proper authority, assuming control over property that wasn't theirs. Their repeated attempts to fine him were not based on legitimate claims but on a fundamental misunderstanding of the land's ownership. As the case continued, Sarah's strategic presentation of the evidence began to erode the opposition's position. The testimony of the expert witness, who had confirmed the federal ownership of the road, was a turning point in the case. The expert's credentials were impeccable, and their testimony was irrefutable. The legal standing of the road was crystal clear, and Mason had never been liable for its maintenance. It became increasingly evident that the HOA's case was not grounded in law, but in their desire to control and manipulate the situation. Todd Ellison's strategy of using community sentiment to create a narrative of negligence was failing. The court had been presented with the facts, and those facts left no room for doubt. The hidden bias that had influenced the HOA's actions was now in full view. The board had acted without proper verification, issuing fines based on assumptions. Karen's personal involvement in pushing for the fines was indicative of a broader issue within the HOA's management practices. Their actions were motivated by a desire to control the neighborhood and enforce their rules, without considering whether those rules were legal or fair. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, it was clear that the HOA's position was untenable. The evidence had shown that Mason was not responsible for the road's condition, and the fines imposed on him had been unjustified from the start. The case had revealed not only the flaws in the HOA's legal approach but also the personal biases that had driven their actions. In the end, the court would need to make a decision based on the law, not on the emotions or biases of the individuals involved. The facts were clear. Mason was not guilty of any wrongdoing, and the HOA had overstepped its bounds. The trial had exposed a failure of due diligence, and it was time for the court to hold the HOA accountable for its actions. Sarah stood up and addressed the court, her tone clear and confident. "Your Honor, the case before you is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. My client, Mr. Mason, has been falsely accused of neglecting a road that is not under his control. The road in question is owned by the National Park Service, a federal entity. Therefore, Mr. Mason has no legal obligation to maintain it, and the HOA's fines against him are both unfounded and unjustified." Sarah paused to let her words settle before continuing. "We have provided records from the National Park Service that confirm their ownership of the road. These records make it clear that the HOA has no jurisdiction over this property, and, therefore, cannot impose fines for its maintenance. The HOA's actions have been based on a misidentification of the property, and they have failed to verify the ownership status before issuing fines." A moment of silence passed through the courtroom as the judge scanned the documents that Sarah had submitted. It was evident that the new information was causing a shift in the direction of the case. Sarah's assertion had struck at the heart of the matter. The HOA had overstepped its bounds, issuing fines for something that was not their responsibility. Sarah continued, "We have also examined the complaints that were made against Mr. Mason. If you look at these complaints closely, it becomes evident that they were based on the assumption that the road was under the HOA's control. These complaints are not based on factual information, but rather on an incorrect assumption about property ownership." The judge, now holding the documents, looked up. "You're telling me that the HOA was fining Mr. Mason for a road they don't control?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah confirmed. "The National Park Service owns the road, and the HOA never had any legal right to issue fines for it. Mr. Mason has not neglected the road. He has simply been wrongly targeted due to the HOA's failure to verify the road's ownership." To strengthen her case, Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out an official letter from the National Park Service. "And if I may add, Your Honor," she continued, "this is a letter from the National Park Service, confirming their ownership of the road and their assertion that there is no obligation on Mr. Mason's part to maintain or manage it." She handed the letter to the judge, who took a moment to read it. As the judge reviewed the letter, the courtroom remained still, all eyes on the bench. It was clear that the weight of this new evidence was sinking in. The letter from the National Park Service provided an undeniable confirmation that Mason was not responsible for the road's upkeep, and the HOA's accusations had no legal foundation. The judge glanced up after reading the letter, his expression somber. The facts were now clear, and it was evident that the HOA had acted without due diligence in pursuing the fines. Sarah's argument had completely undermined the HOA's position. The judge spoke, his voice steady. "It seems that the HOA has acted on incomplete and incorrect information. They imposed fines on Mr. Mason for something that was outside his control, and they failed to properly investigate the ownership of the property before taking legal action." A sense of finality began to take hold in the courtroom as the judge processed the implications of the new evidence. The case had shifted significantly. with the factual inaccuracies of the HOA's claims now fully exposed. It was no longer a question of negligence or failure to act. It was a matter of a legal system being misused to enforce unjust penalties based on flawed assumptions. Sarah sat back down, her face calm but focused. She knew the case had turned in Mason's favor. The facts had been presented clearly, and the truth had emerged. Mason was not responsible for the road, and the HOA had no legal grounds for their claims. The courtroom was silent as the judge deliberated. The revelation that the road was federally owned and that the HOA had no right to fine Mason was a pivotal moment in the trial. The judge would now have to consider not only the immediate implications of the case, but also the broader question of accountability for the HOA's actions. Mason sat in his seat, watching as the proceedings continued. The case had shifted from an individual dispute over property maintenance to a broader examination of authority and accountability within homeowner associations. This was no longer about a fine. It was about ensuring that organizations like the HOA could not act recklessly, imposing penalties based on faulty information and unchecked power. The judge's next decision would be crucial, but it was clear that the truth had been exposed. The court had been presented with irrefutable evidence that Mason was not guilty of the charges against him, and the road, in fact, was not his responsibility. The legal framework that had supported the HOA's claims was now in tatters, and the case was on the verge of reaching a resolution that would vindicate Mason and hold the HOA accountable for their actions. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, glanced up from the documents. "It seems clear to me that the HOA has made a grave error." His voice was steady but carried the weight of finality. The words cut through the atmosphere of the courtroom, signaling that the tide had turned decisively in Mason's favor. Karen Preston, the HOA representative, sat frozen. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving her face pale and her posture rigid. She glanced at her legal counsel, Todd Ellison, who seemed prepared to respond, but the judge raised his hand, silencing him before he could speak. The authority in the judge's gesture was unmistakable. "Mason," the judge continued, addressing him directly, "you are free from any obligation to pay this fine. The HOA is to retract their claim immediately. As for any further legal action, I suggest they consult their own records more carefully before proceeding with another complaint." The courtroom erupted into low murmurs as the judge's decision was announced. For Mason, the relief was almost tangible, though it took a few moments for the full weight of the decision to sink in. The fines had been rescinded, and the claim against him was nullified. They had failed to uphold their case, and now they would have to accept the legal consequences of their own negligence. Sarah, sitting beside Mason, exchanged a brief but meaningful glance with him. Without a word, she stood and gave him a firm pat on the back. "You did it. You fought back," she said with a small but confident smile. It was a simple statement, but it marked the end of a long, arduous battle that had been fought not just in the courtroom, but against a system that had relied on unchecked authority. Assumptions, but in the end, the facts had won out. For the first time in weeks, Mason felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't just a victim of an overzealous homeowners association. He had taken a stand and fought for what was right. He had proved that an individual, when armed with the right knowledge and resources, could take on a system that sought to exploit them, though the battle had been won. Mason knew the fight for fairness and accountability was far from over. The HOA might not back down easily, and other communities might still face similar challenges. But for now, Mason could breathe easy, knowing that he had stood up for himself and, by extension, for others who might be facing the same unjust treatment. As he left the courthouse, Sarah by his side, Mason knew one thing for certain. The system had been challenged, and the truth had prevailed. No matter what came next, he had made a stand, and that in itself was a victory. The case wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the power of truth and the need to question authority when it oversteps its bounds.